Hello again, everybody. EricTheCarGuy here. And today we're going to be talking about testing an alternator before you replace it. So we're going to go through the testing process of finding out if you have a bad alternator or if there's some other issue in the system. This episode is also brought to you by BBB Industries that remanufacture alternators and starters to meet or exceed OE specifications. Anyway, we're going to start, anytime we're talking about the electrical system or doing any kind of electrical diagnosis, we always start at the battery. So let's head over to the battery and do some checks there. Okay, once we locate the battery, and some vehicles it may be more difficult than others to try and locate the battery. Sometimes they're underneath back seats, under fender wells, all kinds of places that they hide these things on you. But once you do find it and you suspect that you have a charging issue or something like that, the first thing that I always check for is the condition of the battery connections themselves. You want to make sure that the battery connection is clean and tight. So many electrical problems actually originate here at connections and also at the battery. There's corrosion that builds up over time that creates a resistance between the battery terminal itself and the cable, which in turn compromises the performance of not only the battery but the charging system and alternator also. So you want to take a look. You want to grab the cables and move them around and see if they're loose at all. And if they're loose, obviously tighten them. And you also want to check to see if they do have any of that corrosion. If they do have that corrosion, you want to do what you can to try to clean that up and put that all back together, and then make sure you have good connections at the battery before you proceed to the next step in testing. Something I forgot to mention, and that is temperature. Battery performance is very much dependent upon temperature. So whenever you're doing the testing that we're about to show next, try to make sure that you're doing the testing between 60 and 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So you don't want to do the testing above 100 degrees and you don't want to do it below 60 degrees. This will ensure that you're getting an accurate test. Now I'm going to start by turning my tester on, and I want to make sure that my voltage range is, on this one I'm going to put it at 20 volts. It's not going to exceed 20 volts when I do this testing. But then I'm going to take my positive and negative leads and put them on the positive and negative leads of the battery. If I'm getting a strange reading like this, there we go. You might need to scrape a little bit off of that corrosion. And this goes right back to my point of connections and how important they are, because without a good connection, you aren't going to get a good reading. Okay, and that's pretty much barely good, because you want to see a reading that's above 12.4. So 12.47 is a good reading. If you see a reading that's above 12.6 volts, the battery is overcharged and you need to remove the surface charge on the battery. And there's a couple of different ways you can do that. You can either turn the headlights on for a couple of minutes, or you can crank the engine with the ignition system disabled so that you can take that surface charge off the battery so that you can get an accurate reading. But a reading above 12.4 volts is ideal in a situation like this. After you've removed the surface charge from the battery, if there is one, you want to make sure to wait a few minutes before you go back and do your testing, because you want the system to stabilize a little bit. So just give it a couple of minutes after you've either turned on the headlights or cranked the engine in order to do that so that you get an accurate reading. Now that you're sure that your surface charge has been removed and your terminals and all that kind of stuff are clean, you're just going to do a general check of the alternator output. And to do that, you start the engine, run it at about 1500 RPM, and you're looking for a reading of less than 15.5 volts. If it's more than 15.5 volts, that would indicate an overcharging condition, which is just as bad as an undercharging condition. So you want to make sure you don't exceed that. There are some systems that may run more, but for the most part, don't exceed 15.5 volts. That was a good reading. Now if you go to start this up and run it and you actually have less than battery voltage just from the get-go, then you know the alternator may not be putting out, but don't condemn the alternator right away. Go and check those connections at the alternator itself, check the wiring, Check the wiring going to the voltage regulator also for any kind of damage. Look for any other external cause besides the alternator. Don't condemn the alternator right away if you do find that condition. One more thing to check before you get started is check the belt tensioner. If the belt tension is not sufficient in order to spin the alternator, if the alternator doesn't spin, it can't produce electricity. So you want to make sure that you've got a nice tight belt and that it's secure to the pulley, and that the pulley doesn't have any movement in the front of it. Anything that might cause this not to spin efficiently. Alright, now we're going to have some fun and we're going to load this alternator up a little bit. And what we're going to do is we're going to put a load onto the system by turning on everything electrical that we can possibly get our hands on. Push every button, turn everything on, rear defroster, air conditioning, everything that uses up electricity in the system. And that will pretty much make it so the alternator has to put out as good as it possibly can. And we're looking for a reading that's above battery voltage, which right now is right around 12.5. So anything that's at least half a volt above that means that the alternator is working. If we can exceed that, great. That means that alternator is awesome and doing a great job. I'd say this guy's doing all right. Now you're asking the really good question, Eric, what if the voltage is not above battery voltage by at least half a volt? There are two types of regulators. There are external voltage regulators and internal voltage regulators. If it is an external voltage regulator, recommend replacing that voltage regulator if you find that the voltage falls below specifications there. If it's an internal regulator, in other words, if the regulator is part of the alternator assembly, then replace the alternator. Well, actually, before you go to replace the alternator, once again, I can't stress enough how you need to go through and check all those connections and make sure all that stuff is good before you go and replace the alternator. But if you find those connections are clean and tight and the way they're supposed to be, then the alternator is bad and should be replaced. On a lot of modern vehicles, voltage regulation is also controlled by the ECU. And I don't want to rule out the possibility that there could be a problem with the ECU not sending a command to the alternator to put out the proper voltage. So keep in mind that may be a possibility. Now that's going to be specific to vehicle, so you're going to have to check with the service manual for that vehicle to find out how to check to see if the computer signal is getting to the alternator itself in those instances. But just keep in mind that that's another possibility that could step in besides corroded connections or something going on with the wiring as something that's not an alternator problem. And that's basically why we're going through this. We're trying to make it so that you're absolutely sure when you remove that alternator and go ahead and replace it that is the problem. So oftentimes it could be something else. So you don't want to just go off and replace things. You want to test them a little bit. You know I'm all about that kind of thing. Something that I thought of when thinking about that computer-controlled voltage regulation is you can actually bypass the voltage regulation of an alternator many times. And once again, this is specific to manufacturer in many cases, but you do something that's called a full field test, to where basically you tell the alternator to put out as much as it possibly can, and if it does change, if you've got a situation where a voltage regulator is bad in an alternator, you can bypass that voltage regulator and just tell the alternator to put out all the time. Once again, that's kind of specific to manufacturer, but that's another way of eliminating, like say, a computer-controlled issue or a voltage regulation issue, whether it's an external or internal voltage regulator. You can take that out of the system, so to speak, by doing that full field test. So for your particular vehicle and an application, look into full field testing for that alternator and do a full field test on it. And if you are able to get voltage that's well above battery voltage at that point, then you know that the problem is with voltage regulation and not necessarily a problem with the alternator being able to produce electricity. Lastly, we want to completely eliminate the possibility that there's an issue with increased resistance in the circuitry or the conductors in the circuit. And we can do this by doing voltage drops on both the positive and negative side of the system. So we're going to do a voltage drop on the positive side of the system from the positive output at the back of the alternator to the positive battery cable, and we're also going to do one on the ground side from the ground cable to the case of the alternator and see if there's a voltage drop there. If we do see an excessive voltage drop there, then we know that there's a problem in the circuit and not necessarily with the battery or the alternator. Okay, now to check the negative side voltage drop. And for that, we're going to have to load up the system. So you want to go back and you want to turn all of your accessories back on, except for the rear window defroster. So turn on your AC, your wipers, your headlights, and everything, and take one lead and put it on battery negative. Take the other lead and put it on the case of the alternator. And if there's a reading that's greater than 0.1 or 0.2, then there's increased resistance on the ground side of the circuit. So I'm going to go turn all the accessories on now. Oh, and the other thing is we want to raise the engine RPM up to about 2,000 RPM while we do this test. So we connect the positive lead to battery negative. And the other lead, we're going to touch the outside of the case of the alternator. Right now, there's nothing. Nothing at all. Which is a good reading, but I still have to raise the RPMs here. Oh, there we go. 0.01. We got a reading there of 0.01 volts. That's awesome. That means there is virtually no resistance in the ground side circuit of the system. And actually this alternator is functioning properly. So it's good to know that we're looking at a good system so that if we see something that varies from that. Now, the specifications are from 0.1 to 0.2. So if you see anything 0.1, 0.2 and above, you know that there's a lot of resistance in the ground side of the circuit. So you want to go through and check all the grounds, like maybe the engine to body ground, maybe which those ground straps can break on occasion, or the one that goes from the battery down to the engine block itself. Maybe there's some corrosion there or some damage to the cable, something that could cause that increased resistance in the circuit. But from what we saw, 0.01, that's good to go. The point of this video is to try to help you out in a situation like, say for instance, you have a no charging situation and it's actually caused by something external and not the alternator itself. So I'm trying to get it to where you can maybe avoid several trips to the parts store, taking back what you believe to be a bad alternator, something of that nature. I can't stress enough about connections, and especially the connections at the battery. And some battery terminals have a tendency to corrode more than others, and some terminals that are not necessarily factory terminals that are put into place, that cable gets a bunch of corrosion on it in that little crimp connection and can create all kinds of electrical problems. No starts, no charging, all that. And those voltage drops that we did, that will show that. So if you have a voltage drop that's greater than those specifications that I gave you, either on the positive or negative side, you know what side of the circuit you're dealing with and you know where the problem is. So definitely don't rule that stuff out. Also, don't forget about those computer controls that could come into play. External voltage regulators also can be an issue. In fact, you're probably more apt to replace a voltage regulator than you are an alternator, in many cases, at least in my experience. But anyway, neither here nor there. The point is, do some due diligence. Go through your testing, figure out what the issue is, and if you do have a bad alternator, you'll know. There will be no question. I'm going to stop talking about this and also remind you that this video was in part brought to you by BBB Industries, that remanufactures starters and alternators to meet or exceed OE fit, form, and function. I am Eric the Car Guy. You can always visit me at EricTheCarGuy.com or find me on Facebook and Twitter. And that's about all I can think of for today. But anyway, take your time, do some testing, and find out if you really need to replace that part. Be safe, have fun, stay dirty. Take care, people.